So as far as where we've been tracking on Sunday mornings, if you haven't been with us, this is your first time either stopping in on a Sunday morning or you're visiting, passing through the area, we're going to do a little recap real fast. So this is a good morning for you to show up, and we'll cover what we've talked about just in brief over the last 2 or 3 Sundays. But we've started the series called Rediscovering the Bible, and we're really kind of aiming at a couple of things. One is you may be newer to looking at the Bible and trying to read it and hear from the Lord with it. And so if that's you, we're just looking at some tips to kind of ways to approach the Bible in the closer way that maybe it was written to be approached in the first place. So we're kind of getting education in that. But for those of you, maybe you've been a believer or a follower of Jesus for like 10, 20, 30 years, and you feel like you have a pretty good concept of the Bible. I feel like there's always something new to learn. And I've been surprised personally at how much I've learned that I'll be sharing over the next few weeks, especially, that it wasn't on my radar previously. And so hopefully, even if you've been around the Bible for a long time, you'll learn some new things that can help you approach the Bible in an even better way. And if you have a handle on all these things, you can help support other people on that journey. And you can look around in this church community or your own church communities, wherever you're from, and look for people who are kind of discovering the Bible for the first time. And maybe you can help them walk through that journey as well and do it as a community. So there's different ways that you might approach this depending on what your familiarity with the Bible is. But that's kind of what our series is on. We're just looking at better ways to understand the Bible. Sometimes my clicker works really well, sometimes it doesn't, so we'll see what we're up against this morning. But so far, I'm all right. So just a little bit of review. We looked at a few weeks ago the basic storyline of the Bible. And the Bible, believe it or not, there's a central story that you can trace throughout it, which is amazing because there's about 66 different books in our English Bibles, and those have been written over a period of, at least 1,500 years of time. And so this massive time, but it's all organized to form one unified story. And so here's just the basics of that. I know the print's pretty small up here. If you want a copy of this, I can get you a copy of this and make it available online as well in future weeks. But basically, God starts out, he makes a good world. And then God makes and appoints these human partners to work with him and to carry out what his vision for this whole magnificent world is. God sets a boundary, and that boundary line is his wisdom and his ideas and his knowledge of what good and bad are versus humanity's. He uses this tree to give them a choice, and basically he's saying, you can go this route with me, and I can teach you about what good and bad is and how my world is supposed to operate and how we're supposed to interact with each other and how humans are supposed to interact in a way that will further this purpose, or you can decide that on your own. And humanity, of course, decides, we think we can discover wisdom and what's good and bad and define that for our own, maybe even better than what God could tell us. And so they latch onto that and they rebel against God, and corruption starts to infect the world. And then as things spiral downward further and further, God, instead of approaching humanity as a whole, he picks one family, Abraham's family. And he enters into a relationship with Abraham and his descendants to try to show the world a picture of what life that revolves around him and goes back to his definition of good and bad might look like. And then Abraham's family grows and becomes a nation, and that nation is called Israel. And that nation commits to a working relationship and a partnership with God and says, yes, we would like to live this way. You tell us what your world was intended to look like and function like and how we're supposed to relate with each other. We'll do that. And then these people who had these advantages, this relationship with God, just like the rest of us, repeatedly fail over and over and over and over again. And then God sends these prophets, these spokespeople, to warn them of consequences of doing things their own way, and they fail further. But then these prophets also carry a message of ultimate hope. God can pull you up out of this. He has a plan to rescue you. And then we track from the Old Testament into the New Testament, and God sends this rescuer, and his name is Jesus. And the more you read about him, the more you realize this Jesus is the God of the Bible that you've been encountering in the Old Testament as well. And this Jesus gives his life ultimately as a way of restoring humanity back into a relationship with God. And then God starts pursuing all the nations, not just Abraham's family and his descendants, but these Jesus followers spread out into the world. And that's kind of this moment in time that we are in currently. It's still happening. God's pursuing the nations through Jesus' followers. And then at some point in the Bible story, Jesus is said to be returning as king. And then at the very end, in the last pages of the Bible, there is a new creation that's developed where God and his human partners are ruling the world together in the same way that he set out to do on the first couple pages of the Bible. And so that's the story arc. It's this unified story, and everything ties into that story somehow. So we talked about how when we read the Bible, we don't want to isolate specific stories. We're actually going to play around with this in just a moment. We're going to do an exercise and see how crazy we can get with our Bible explanations today. So, but everything is going to tie in to this story in one of those areas. We also talked about different main types of literature that are in the Bible, how there are narratives, or what you would call Bible stories. There are poems. A third of the Bible is actually poetry. And then there are a lot of speeches and letters that the Bible is comprised of as well. See if my clicker cooperates. Oh, there we go. All right. Or maybe that was Gene pretending to be the clicker. But talked about how those different types of literature, we kind of have to read them slightly differently. Just as if you pulled out a book of contemporary poetry, you might approach it a little bit differently than if you pulled out a fiction novel or a nonfiction book, right? They're communicating in slightly different ways. So we talked about Bible narratives, what we would call Bible stories, and how they are not just records of people's life events. It's not like a history that includes all the details. They're actually characters who are in a specific setting, and they're experiencing a series of events. I think calling them scenes is probably the best way for us to relate to that, in our day and age. But these scenes have been selected and they've been arranged by writers to form a plot or a storyline. So when you read about a new set of characters in a new place, there's this central storyline, not just through the Bible as a whole, but through that specific story or that narrative. There's a plot, there's a storyline, something's happening, it's all leading up to some point, and then there are changes that characters are experiencing as a result. And so most of these plots, let's see if this will go again. It's always a grab bag. They follow this basic pattern, and that is that characters get introduced in some kind of setting, and it always varies, and then something new or unexpected happens. There's always new and unexpected things happening in each of these different Bible narratives. Just like real life, always something new and unexpected to navigate. And then these problems arise because it's never an easy story. It's never an easy road, and neither is ours, right? If you're in retirement years, or you're dealing with adult children, or you have young children in the home, or teenagers, or you're just, right now, maybe you're in your teenage years, or you're in your 20s trying to figure out what life is going to look like. There are always things that complicate, right, the direction, and they always take us in unexpected places and unexpected ways. And there's conflicts that our lives build up to too. And then the conflicts get resolved and it changes characters. And sometimes it's for the better and sometimes it's for the worse, just like real life happens. And so in each of these different stories or narratives, we're seeing a flow. And there are different scenes that are leading us through those changes that those particular characters are experiencing. And so we need to consider what we're reading in the context of that bigger story that these scenes are a part of. And so before we jump into that and we play around with something this morning, which should be fun, I want to just talk a little bit more about these narratives and these stories, because when you read the Bible, you need to be aware of the characters and you need to be aware of the settings. The Bible approaches characters and settings a little bit different than your average maybe like fiction series, like Harry Potter, Hunger Games. They're going to approach characters a little differently than what you see in the Bible. This is ancient literature, so we kind of have to step into their world and understand how they approach characters and settings, because it's going to give us a lot more information that we need to understand these stories well. And so here's a few things about Bible characters. First of all, physical descriptions in the Bible are very rarely given of characters. If you pick up a good novel today, you're going to figure out all the details, what this character looks like, what they're wearing, what their hair color and eye color is and all that, and their personality traits and all this. The author is going to immerse you in that. But the Bible is not going to do that. It's going to seem very basic, very stripped down. But when the Bible does tell you details about a character, you'd better pay attention because it's probably going to be significant in the story. It's probably going to be important to realize. And so here's a few ways the Bible might do that. For example, when you read about Abram or Abraham, which we're going to read about him in a moment in this little experimental story that we're going to go into, He's 75 years old, and the fact that he's later on in life, that's going to be really important to the story. His wife, Sarai, is very beautiful. Not just beautiful, but very, very, very beautiful. And so that's going to be important in the story. If you read about a character called Esau later on, he's hairy, and he acts like an animal in the way that he behaves. And so he also kind of looks like one. And his brother Jacob has got really smooth skin, like a snake has smooth skin. So he's going to be slippery and deceptive like the snake that you encountered earlier in the story in the Garden of Eden. And so the ways these characters are described are going to tell you something about those characters. Also, physical traits might reveal a little bit more about moral characteristics. Characters who are short tend to be humble a lot of times. Characters who are tall tend to be prideful. And so these traits are going to show us different things. Also, secondly, names. Names often talk about the character, and they indicate a character's place or their role in the story. What he or she or it will do, or what he or she or it might become. And so Abram, when we encounter him this morning, his name means exalted father. And so there's going to be something that relates to him as a father in the story. His wife, her name means princess, or it could also be translated powerful woman. And she makes some power decisions, and she's kind of treated like his princess. And then a couple other ways, maybe not so much so. There's another character we encounter. His name is Lot. And Lot means clingy. And he's a very clingy person. He stays really close to his uncle Abraham and his aunt Sarai. And so the characters' names are going to reveal something oftentimes about the character itself. And so a question here. How can I find the meaning of a character's name? Because when you open up the Bible and you read through it, it doesn't say so-and-so's name means so-and-so. There are different tools that are available online, and I want to show you really quickly one that you might use. It's one that I use, and I feel like it's one of the easier ones to navigate. And if you want some more like specific step-by-step, I'd be happy to sit down with you and show you how this works. But there are other tools available and even books that you can purchase. But this is what I use. It's called blueletterbible.org. And so basically, I'm going to show you in the next couple screens how this works. If you pull it up online, there's a search bar at the top, and you can choose your chapter and verses, and then your translation that you use. And so when you do that, you'll pull up, I think this has Genesis chapter 12 or something up on it. It's really tiny print, but there's that little blue box to the side of several of them, like 3 of them that you can see on there. And inside it says tools. So if you click on that box next to the verse, it's going to expand the verse, and it's going to show everything word by word. There's a little number that's in the second column down. And if you click on that small little number, it's the one that's highlighted in red if you can see it. I know the print's small on this, but what it's going to do is, there we go. It's going to go and expand that word out, and it's going to give you some meanings for that specific name. And so that's just one way that you can figure out the meanings of these characters' names. There are different tools that will help you out with that. So just so that you know, there are a lot of tools that are available to give you insights into those characters if you need it. And so one final thing, a character's circumstances and actions, they imitate real life. So you're not going to find the perfect heroic character and the perfect villain in the Bible. In fact, most of the time in the Bible, you're going to find characters who are very unpredictable. They're a mixture of good and bad. And after you read the story, you're going to sit back and go, was that character good or was that character bad? I don't know. But it imitates real life, because if you do an inventory of your own life, chances are you'll hit these points and you'll go, well, am I a good person or a bad person? Because here I made these choices, and there I made those choices, and some of them are great, and some of them were not so great. And that's the same thing that you see in the Bible. But as a result of that, the characters become mirrors. So we see ourselves, good points and bad points, in light of those characters, and they help us look in the mirror and discover who we are as a person, the good and the bad. The Bible also isn't going to tell us a lot about characters' thoughts and motives. We're going to have to read the story and try to figure out what their motives were, what their thoughts were, whether their actions were really good or bad on our own. Whereas a lot of books today will just spell it out. This character did this was horrible or whatever, and the Bible is going to make you think and to some extent sit in that and wonder. But it's doing that on purpose to cause you to talk with other people who are also reading these stories and to have discussions so that you try to, figure out your thoughts on this together. It's making you work and making you look in the mirror at yourself. And so that's what the Bible characters are doing, and it's different than the stories and novels that you would read if you pick up one that's written in the last few years today. Last thing I want to talk about before we jump into this little example are Bible settings. And so setting, it's a narratives, a stories, place, and time and pace. And so it might be the location on a map that a story takes place, and you might have to do a little internet search on that too, because these are places in the Middle East, and they're ancient places. So it might take a little bit of work to figure out where things are going on. Also, a setting involves when in time it happened, and that could be like the year or the century. And we're talking about things that happened over 2,000 years ago in these passages. So that's going to take a little bit of work as well. And sometimes the length of time or the time of day something happens. Another aspect is the pace. Some narratives slow the motion way down. If you're reading through a gospel, take Mark, for example, the pace is super fast. It's like, and next this happened, and quickly this happened, and suddenly this happened. And then things get to the last 24 hours of Jesus' life, and it's like the brakes get put on. And everything slows down, and there are several chapters devoted to a period of hours, where the last few chapters were devoted to a period of years. And so that change in pace in the setting, too, makes us stop and focus, and it's the Bible's way of pointing out things that are super important for us to spend time on and digest. And so settings work in that way. Also, a setting in the Bible assumes that you've read what comes before that. And that's tricky too, because a lot of us are used to kind of doing the grab bag Bible study, or we start in the New Testament, right? Somebody tells us, read the Gospel of John or read the Gospel of Matthew or something. We're like, okay, well, great. And you get an introduction to Jesus, but you have no idea of a lot of things that are mentioned in these stories. They refer to previous places, things in the past. And so the authors are assuming that you've read everything that comes before that up to that point. They're also building expectations. And what you find if you read through many of these stories, similar settings build similar expectations. For example, you read stories and the setting is in the wilderness, in the desert. And you notice over and over again, when I read stories that are set in the wilderness and the desert, there's always this period of transition or testing that happens. Or if you read Bible stories where characters are moving toward the east, they're always going toward exile or some distance relationally. It's not a good thing. If you read about Egypt, you realize who knows what's going to happen. Sometimes great things happen in Egypt, and sometimes horrific things happen in Egypt, and you just never know what to expect. If you read about Babylon, you know there's going to be some serious human rebelling against what God set out in the first place. Even numbers can be settings. If you read about something and it mentions 3 days or 3 things, it's probably going to involve new life or resurrection in some way. If you read about the number 40, it's probably going to involve a waiting period with a test at the end. And so you realize these authors, they're building your expectations. But then on occasion, they break your expectation. They'll set a story in a certain place or tell a story about Jesus going down to Egypt. And instead of a catastrophic event, it's the thing that rescues him. And so they'll play with that as well to show you something that's different or something that's important. And so characters and settings help us learn more about the story and help us see more of what the Bible authors are intending to communicate. So now I have a little fun. And I picked a Bible narrative. And we are going to take a method that I was taught a lot growing up. And it's pretty basic. You might have heard something similar. And we're going to try it out and see what happens. We're not going to think about the fact that these are set in a narrative and a storyline. We're not really going to pay attention to characters. We're not going to pay attention to the setting. We're just going to read it for what it speaks to us in the moment. One of the most popular methods of approaching the Bible is you pick a place to read. So open up to a story somewhere. You are going to view this story as pretty much, literal, unless it says there's some symbolism there, like you're just going to take it at face value. And then you're going to write down some observations, things that you notice, and you're going to draw some personal conclusions from the story. And then you're going to find some ways to apply it in your life, and you're going to pray. And that was kind of the method that I was taught for approaching the Bible. And so I want to drop in someplace, and I'm going to pick Genesis 12 and follow that approach, and we're going to see what ends up. We're not really going to, again, pay attention to some of these things we've just talked about the last couple of weeks. We're just going to approach it at, face value, what hits us. So here's the passage. It says in Genesis 12, verses 10 and following, it says, there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to stay there for a while because the famine in the land was severe. Makes sense, right? When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, look, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they're going to say, this is his wife, and they're going to kill me, but they're going to let you live. So please, say you're my sister so it'll go well for me because of you, and my life will be spared on your account. Don't tell him you're my wife. Tell him you're my sister. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. So I guess Abraham predicted that one, right? Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, so the woman was taken into Pharaoh's household. He treated Abram well because of her. And Abram acquired flocks and herds, male and female donkeys, male and female slaves, and camels. But the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh sent for Abram and said, what have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say to me, she's my sister, so that I took her as my wife? Now, here's your wife. Take her and go. Then Pharaoh gave his men orders about him, and they sent him away with his wife and all he had. Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, and he and his wife and all he had, and Lot with him. Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and gold. So we've taken a scene. We're just going to approach this. We're going to write down our observations and our conclusions and our applications. And here's some of mine, and I want you to see how you feel about this. Here's some observations. Abram moved to Egypt to feed his family. All right? There's a famine. 2, Abram, he had a beautiful wife. 3, Abram was kind of a paranoid guy because his thoughts are like, they're going to take my wife and kill me. That's a little bit of paranoia, right? 4th, Abram asked his wife to lie about her identity. Happened, right? Say you're my sister. 5th, Abram got rich as a result of her lies. He got cattle, he got slaves, he got camels, got all this stuff. 6, God punished Pharaoh for marrying someone who said she was single. Right? Claimed to be his sister. Pharaoh married her. Pharaoh got punished. All right. 7, Abram and Sarah had 0 negative consequences. Were there any negative consequences that story mentioned that happened to Abram and Sarai? No. I mean, he got a lot of wealth as a result of this. 8, some guy named Lot left Egypt with Abram. Okay, don't know who Lot was, but he must have picked him up in Egypt. And lastly, Abram gained tons of livestock, silver, and gold. Those are my observations from the story. Okay? Now, I'm going to take those observations, I'm going to draw some conclusions. Because again, I'm just looking at this story because I turned there, I picked a place. Here's what I found. 1, people should relocate in times of famine. I mean, it seems like logical. 2, marrying an attractive person complicates your life. Right? I mean, she was so beautiful that it caused all these problems. 3, asking others to lie can be beneficial. It worked out really well for Abram. He got rich. 4, lying can make people rich. It can. 5th, God punishes people who accidentally wrong others. It's what it seems like happened to me, right? This guy accidentally took somebody's wife he thought was his sister, married her, and plagues happened on his household. 6, God approves of lying because Abram and Sarai didn't experience negative consequences and got rich. Sweet. Learned some new stuff about the Bible today. You're going to go home and just feel enriched. So let's apply this, right? This is going to be exciting. 1, think about where to move if there's a food shortage, because, I mean, right, that's what Abram did. So get some options on the table, because what if we experience a food shortage? Better figure out in Egypt. Two, for a simpler life, marry someone average looking if you're not married. If you are married to an attractive person, be a little more paranoid. You should. I mean, it served Abram well. Four, look for ways to ask others to lie to protect me, because Abram did, and it worked out really well. He asked Sarai to lie, and he was protected, and in fact enriched as a result of it. Fifth, look for opportunities to lie to get rich, because it worked for Abram, and there were no consequences. Six, avoid accidentally wronging people at all costs, because if you accidentally wrong somebody, that's when God drops the hammer. I mean, you might experience plagues on your household because you didn't even know. So lying, that's probably all right, but if you accidentally hurt somebody, woe to you. Seven, lie often and trust that God will bless me. That's what the story teaches when you use that approach. Why do you feel uncomfortable with that? Well, maybe you have a larger scope of morality personally, or maybe you have a little more experience with the Bible, or maybe you're aware that in Abram's story, that's only part of the story. What we did is we took a scene and we analyzed it and we made some conclusions, but we completely divorced the scene from the rest of the narrative. And if you look at where the rest of the narrative is going, what you see is somebody who's continually on this path of making some great leaps and bounds and also really hitting the wall hard a few times to struggle with living life by faith. He does some incredible things that take a lot of faith, and then he falls flat on his face, and he does a lot of things that lean on himself and his own abilities to navigate situations and to solve his own problems, and it all leads up to some more important conflicts and kind of a climax of events in his development of faith. And that's the larger story. But when you don't think about the characters and the setting and the way that the plot line is developing, you can take the Bible and you can gain some pretty incorrect ways of interpreting things. What I put on this last slide, and we're gonna reapproach this passage next week and ask some of the questions we've been talking about over the last 3 or 4 weeks and try to get a better read on understanding those same passages. But when we isolate an individual scene from its larger narrative in the Bible, we end up getting messages that the author and the Spirit of God who moved the author never intended. And even though this story was maybe a little bit easy for you to see, okay, they were lying, that probably isn't good, even though it looks like it's good, there are other stories in the Bible that you might not see that in. And you might come away and walk away with some ideas and think, well, this is exactly what that story is telling me. But if you don't look at things in the larger picture, you'll come away, again, with messages that the author and that the Holy Spirit never intended for you to see. So that's why we're going through these types of series, so that we can approach the Bible in ways that will allow us to connect with the messages that the authors were really intending to communicate. But it takes a little bit of work, and it takes looking at things in the context of the entire storyline. And so, again, we have to use caution and we have to be educated when we do these things, right? When we handle the Bible, because it's not just always looking at something and saying how it impresses us at face value. Because again, lying's fine. It's beneficial, right? Come away from church with that today. But we know, or we have an idea, not really. So next week we'll look at some, not all, but some really good questions to ask as we approach this passage. So more next week. If you won't be joining us, we'll have these services up online if you're curious what we're going to talk about next week. But these are all things to keep in mind as we read our Bibles and we want to understand things more effectively.